Let me, on behalf of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, welcome you all to this panel discussion on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on food and nutrition security in India. The Foundation, as many of you would know, is a charitable trust based in India and established in 2003. Its major objective is to facilitate multidisciplinary theoretical and empirical inquiry in the field of agrarian studies in India and also elsewhere in less developed countries. The foundation works as an association, a network of a wide section of people interested in the agrarian question, which includes scholars and academics from different institutes and universities, as well as members of mass organizations working in the countryside, of peasants, of workers, and women. Since April 2020, the foundation has been at the forefront of studies of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdown in the Indian countryside. A major special issue of the Review of Agrarian Studies, the journal of the foundation, brought together articles on the pandemic and agrarian condition in India and different parts of the world. In April and May 2020, we also conducted a rapid assessment survey through telephonic interviews across 21 villages in 10 states of the country. Our team members, collaborators, and trustees have been participating in discussions on and around the subject in the last 6 months. In the course of this work, we realized that the effects of the COVID-19 crisis are still unfolding, are evolving, and has to be consistently studied. The outcome of this realization was the establishment of a pandemic studies unit focusing on the impact of the pandemic on agriculture, agriculture production, rural employment, women's work in rural India, food security, and other such matters. This unit, the Pandemic Studies Unit, is currently engaged in another round of surveys through telephonic surveys studying the Kharif production cycle. This panel discussion is yet another output of the study unit, and we sincerely hope that it will contribute to the discussion and our understanding on the impact of the pandemic on food and nutrition security in India. I thank the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, who have been very supportive of this idea since its beginning and has been supporting the work of the study unit. Without further ado, let me call upon the chair of today's panel, V. Sridhar, Associate Editor, Frontline Magazine. Sridhar specializes in economic journalism, including issues of farm economy. He has been consistently writing on the impact of COVID on the Indian economy in the last few months. And his most recent cover story was on the farm reform bills, which he termed as a battering ram instead of reform. Sridhar, I invite you to take the chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandeepan. Welcome, good evening. Welcome to the panel discussion on the pandemic's impact on food security in India, organized by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. Today we have 3 speakers on our panel, Professor Abhijit Sen, Dr. Kalyani Raghunathan, and Professor Madhura Swaminathan. They will be speaking in that order. Our first speaker will be Professor Abhijit Sen, the Professor of Economics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and a former member of the National Planning Commission. Professor Sen has also been a chairman of a number of official commissions, including the high-level Committee on Long-Term Grain Policy and the Commission for Agricultural Costs and Prices. He's also served in the past on the Prime Minister's Task Force on Agricultural Economics and Rural Development and the Expert Committee on Rural Credit. Professor Sen will address the issues pertaining to the agricultural production capacity and how and to what extent it has been impaired since the pandemic hit India. He will also speak about the consequences for the agricultural supply chain, as well as the distributional consequences of the impact on on peasant incomes and livelihoods. Our second speaker, Dr. Kalyani Raghunathan, is an economist who works at the Poverty, Health and Nutrition Division at the South Asia Office of the International Food Policy Research Institute in Delhi. She will draw from her most recent paper on a neglected aspect of food security, that is the capability of rural households to obtain a basic level of nutrition. Although it does not address the post-COVID situation directly, the findings reveal a shocking situation in rural India, which could only have turned worse after the pandemic. I will just state one statistic from her study and then leave the rest for her to unveil later. Well before the COVID pandemic, roughly between 2/3 and 3/4 of the Indian rural population, depending on how we measure deprivation, could not afford a minimum normative standard basket of a basic nutritious diet, what she terms as the CORD, or the cost of a recommended diet. Our final speaker will be Professor Madhura Swaminathan. She's the FAS trustee and professor and head of the Economic Analysis Unit at the Indian Statistical Institute in Bangalore. She will speak about the pandemic's consequences for employment and poverty, and thus for food security. Professor Madhura Swaminathan has for many years specialized on aspects of food security in India. Much of her work in this area is reflected in academic publications as well as in the popular media. Today, she will speak about the need to move towards a universal system of transfers mediated by the state, arguing that this would be a good time to abandon the misplaced faith in conditional transfers. She will also highlight how Kerala handled the pandemic, especially in the matter of guaranteeing a basic level of support for all, especially for those at the bottom of the social ladder. Professor Abhijit Sen.
What I've been asked to talk about was production mainly and distributive issues. But before I start on those two things, let me point out another thing which I think we ought to remember because of the way the lockdown operated, mainly as a police operation rather than as a health measure. And the consequence of that was not only that a lot of economic activities were affected, and I'm coming to that, but equally and even more severely, our ability to measure economic activity, that is the statistical system, was also affected. As a result, we have a lot of areas in which the data is incomplete. The most important example of which is that for a whole month, we did not have the CPI, something as simple as the CPI, which can be collected over telephone. And this gets reflected in a number of other areas, and therefore the lenses through which we view the post-pandemic situation and its evolution is itself likely to be somewhat distorted, and therefore any interpretation would have a large subjective element to it. Having said that, let me immediately go on to note there are certain things on which I think there is relatively no disagreement. Number one, production has not only been much less effective than many of us thought it might have been, and in fact, whatever latest statistics we have indicate that this year's production, that is Rabi of 1920 and Kharif of 2021, one was very good, that is the Rabi, and from whatever sowing data that we have, it appears that Kharif is also heading towards a rather good. And this is what the national income statistics is picking up, when it is actually talking about rates of growth of 3% plus and 3.5% in most cases, which is more than our average for the last few years. And that's not unexpected, because rainfall, which still remains a very important determinant of our agricultural production, was not short by any means. If anything, in many places, it was excessive. And given that, which is of course the continuing effect of increasing extreme events during this climate change, I think we were going through a good weather situation, and that's reflected in better agricultural output, with the effect of the pandemic being minor at most. So that's one thing I think most people would agree about. Of course, there are crops in which there have been shortages. There have been parts of the country affected by extreme events where the effect, where output may have fallen. But by and large, I think this is something which most people would agree. Then there are certain types of data which are pretty strong, in the sense that those data, there is no doubt that things are the way the data is saying. The most important one of those is exports from India of agricultural commodities. Now, what is most interesting is that our exports have zoomed of all agricultural commodities, and where they have zoomed the most is, for example, in rice. Rice this year, we are going to be exporting at least 14 million tons, up 3 million tons from last year, and going way beyond anything either we have ever exported or anyone else is now exporting. We are by far the world's largest. So, taking on from a higher production, it seems to have also, and nobody's going to, the export figures are very difficult. I mean, they're easy figures to collect. And they are figures which are vetted both from the side of the exporter and the importer. So a lot seems to have gone out. So from the production end, gross production and that part of production which leaves the country, not only left the country, but before, of course, leaving the country, it left the field, traveled to the ports, so that the logistics there seem to have happened as well. And this is true not just of rice, as I said, but by and large of most crops that we export, and of things like even a buffalo meat, which has had a huge amount of trouble in recent years. This year wasn't back to where it used to stand earlier, but after a little fall, it is now at levels which are pretty much more than normal. And this is also true of our marine exports. It's true of the entire bunch of exports that we have, sugar, whatever it is. The third point of data, and this is where contradictions might start coming in, and note them, is that in two of its most recent meetings, the Reserve Bank of India has used as an excuse for not cutting interest rates the argument that food inflation is outside the range, which makes it possible for them to start tinkering with the interest rates. In other words, inflation policy as taken by the Reserve Bank of India is at the moment predicated by the belief that food inflation is too high. Now we add them all up. It suggests that, it would seem to suggest that you've got reasonable output, pretty buoyant export demand, or something has gone out, and rising food prices. In other words, are we an economy which is going through a period where domestic demand also is outstripping the more than usual production? If it were the case, then of course, much of what Sridhar said, although that's where I'm going to, would be wrong. Because that would mean that here's an economy which through the pandemic produced and then consumed so much that it pushed up prices. That is the RBI's inflation observations. However, to immediately come to some reconciliation, one ought to note that what the Reserve Bank looks at is the consumer price index. It does not look anymore at the wholesale prices. So its inflation targeting is limited to the consumer price. As I said right at the beginning, for 1 month, the consumer price index wasn't even announced. And it has proceeded to go about it, but the consumer price index can be very, very different from the producer prices. And this is indeed the case. Now, recently, Vikas Rawal and his team have been analyzing the wholesale price data for a very large range of commodities from all across the country. And what they find, of course there are variations, but what they find, if I've got to actually summarize, is that there was a massive decline in arrivals in mandis in April, which persisted through most of May. It's now gone up, but arrivals in mandis continue to be relatively low compared. So, for example, mandi arrivals in August or September are less than they were last year, except for a few commodities. As far as prices are concerned, there was a sharp dip in prices. That dip continued till about August, after which there is indeed an increase in the prices of a number of commodities, but not all. And in particular, of course, rice and wheat prices continue to remain low relative to what you might expect given MSP and others. Now, the picture which starts emerging from there is more in line and more in sync with what Sridhar described. That is, as far as output is concerned, that is, the production on the field is concerned, that was probably all right. Didn't get affected too much by the lockdown or the pandemic. But when it came to the incomes of farmers, that is, that output multiplied by the price that the farmer might have expected to receive, that could have well gone down. And most probably did go down, because for much of this period, the wholesale prices were lower. Then, of course, you have the situation that those lower wholesale prices seem to have coexisted with higher consumer prices. Now, that's also quite possible, and in fact expected, if the distribution as defined by transport, storage, the general logistics side, actually incurred very large difficulties, costs. So that would actually push up the difference between the wholesale price and the consumer price considerably. And that is probably, almost certainly, what did happen. Notice, however, that in this formulation, one thing goes unexplained, which is, why are arrivals still so low? Prices are going up now in the mandis. The arrivals have risen somewhat, but they continue to be too low. It suggests that the output which was produced is now in the hands of people who are able to store. The production was stored, but they have not actually arrived in the markets. They are being stored essentially in the villages themselves by some farmers. In other words, the role of direct arrivals at the mandis, which is something which either farmers do themselves, or there are traders who go from village to village, buy things and deliver it to the mandis, or the adatiyas who do that for the larger operators. Those systems were affected, but a class of farmers were able to actually acquire the produce of the less better off classes in order to be able to do the necessary storage, without which we cannot explain what is happening to production versus market arrivals.
Professor Sen, can you wind up in about 3 minutes?
Yep.
Thank you.
The market arrival story is also in part an explanation of why it might look, as I suggested earlier, that demand is doing well. It isn't. All that has happened is that storage has gone up at the production end rather than consumer demand. In other words, for most farmers, incomes have fallen. Some farmers and some people with the ability to store in rural areas have been able to buy off grain or buy off things and are doing well. Overall, the demand from urban areas is still doing very badly, so that the demand is not being reflected in the mandis, and therefore it's arrivals which are not happening. Looking ahead, there are similar statistical issues. Again, one piece of statistics which we can't quarrel with is that we are having record fertilizer sales. They're really record fertilizer sales. So that people are buying as if output is going to be profitable, and they're all. So maybe there will not be any long run effects. But my worry is that there will. The pandemic is going to leave rural areas are going to leave rural areas with a huge deficiency in infrastructure requirements. And unfortunately, capital investment, especially public investment in any form, has been the big one to suffer. Some government expenditure has taken place, but much of it has been in the form of either cash handouts through the through those 3,000 rupees to the farmers, and much of it, and some of it has been through the PDS. How well these welfare measures have worked is a question mark. And I say it's a question mark because, let me remind you, that 3 million ton exports, extra exports of rice that I talked about, was to ports like Kakinada at below MSP. It was not being bought from farmers and exported. Some of it, and maybe much of it, were diversions for the PDS. And if there were diversions, and of course the PDS itself had been expanded because the government had added a whole amount to be distributed, some of it got diverted for export use. And we know that the coverage for the farmers' income schemes was not fully met. Now, since, for example, Madhura and the later speakers are both going to speak, I mean, both Kalyani and Madhura, going to speak on welfare, I think there is a real issue. The Ministry of Agriculture now spends 80% of its money on handing out cash and less than 20% on actually doing anything about agriculture.
Professor Sen, can we...
Okay. And can we continue with this after the pandemic? Thanks. Thanks, Sridhar. I stop.
Thank you. Could we have those watching on, participating on YouTube and Facebook, could they have their queries posted on the chat box? Yeah, Kalyani.
Great, thank you. So I believe that someone will be pulling up my slides. Great. So I'd like to thank the Foundation for Agrarian Studies for organizing this panel and for inviting me to participate, and also for Professor Sen for giving such a great introduction. So after that really wide sweeping initial conversation, what I'm going to be presenting might seem very narrow. I'll be talking about the affordability of nutritious diets in rural India, and I'll be picking up specifically on, as Sridhar mentioned, a recent paper that I and a couple of co-authors published. So this is going to be a very narrow field of study. Next slide, please. So just to kind of give a little bit of a background about why we might care about nutritious diets at all, and I might be preaching to the choir here, but we know that we have high and persistent malnutrition in India. We account for about 1/3 of global stunting and have extremely high rates of maternal and child anemia and underweight. And what isn't really known but is suspected is, of course, that high rates of malnutrition, particularly undernutrition, would interact with the disease burden from COVID in ways that might make it more severe. At the same time, in India, we also have rising overweight and obesity rates, particularly in urban areas, but also quite alarmingly in rural areas. And within this setup, diets are a really key policy parameter. So not only do they occupy a really prominent place in the UNICEF conceptual framework, they're a key immediate cause of malnutrition, diet quality and particularly diet diversity has been linked to micronutrient adequacy, to lower morbidity and mortality from non-communicable diseases. And they're also recommended as double duty actions. So these are actions that simultaneously impact both under and over nutrition. And yet, despite this, there's surprisingly little research on diets in India. And by this, I don't mean research on things like complementary feeding or infant and young child feeding, or even food for pregnant and lactating mothers, on which there is considerably more work, but sort of broad-based work on accessibility and affordability of nutritious diets for the population at large. Next slide. So this is kind of where we came in with this piece of work. So what we do in this analysis is we calculate what is known as the cost of a recommended diet, or CORD, which is the minimum cost of meeting country-specific food-based dietary guidelines. So when I say a food-based dietary guidelines, some of the ones that you might be familiar with are, say, the food pyramids, or pictures of a plate where different portions of the plate are allocated to different food groups. But what's nice about India's food-based dietary guideline is that it can be quantified. So it specifies a set of food groups, a total of 6 of them: starchy staples, proteins, dairy, vegetables, fruits, and oils and fats. And then for each food group, it recommends a portion size and a number of portions. So this is a food-based dietary guideline that can actually be operationalized in terms of costing exercise. And then importantly, for the Indian perspective, the proteins category allows for both animal and plant-based proteins. So the recommended diet can be entirely lacto-vegetarian, which is important because approximately 30% of our population is lacto-vegetarian. So we calculate this cost of meeting these food-based dietary guidelines. And then in order to say something about affordability, we add in information on wages. And in order to do so, we use the wages of unskilled laborers because we believe this is a reasonably good proxy for income of the poor. Next slide. So this is just an extract from the actual manual. This is the National Institute for Nutrition's Dietary Guidelines for Indians. And I'll just point out 2 things and more details are in the paper. But the first is that they have different guidelines for men and for women. And so it is theoretically possible, and we do actually calculate in the paper a cost of a recommended diet for each gender. And then secondly, they differentiate between work of different activity intensity. So for the purpose of our analysis, we assume that unskilled labor is a moderately intense activity. And so we're really focused on that middle portion of the whole graph. Next slide. So for data, we use the National Sample Survey Rural Price and Wage data set. I just want to make the point that this is not the consumption expenditure data set, which is household level. This one actually collects prices from retail outlets. So it has prices for 101 different items or commodities. And it's a district month level panel, and it spans the period of October 2001 to June 2011. And there's a fairly conspicuous gap in the middle around 2008, which was also a period, unfortunately, of rising food prices globally. And so when I present some of the figures later, you'll see a gap in the middle. In addition to the 101 commodities on which we have retail prices, we also have wage data in both cash and kind for 18 different occupations. And we only use one, which is unskilled labor, but there is information on 17 others. Next. And so simply what the core does then is it produces a solution to a linear programming problem, which chooses the cheapest commodities in each of those 6 recommended food groups according to the guidelines, calculates the total amount that would need to be spent in order to meet the portion size requirements, and then adds those up across the food groups to produce the overall cost of this recommended diet. Next. So I'm turning now to some results, and I'll start with this depiction of the most common items across the various different food groups that this chord method throws up. And the purpose for doing this is to make the point that these recommended diets that come out of a chord type calculation are fairly realistic. So if one were instead to do something like a cost of calorie adequacy measure, that would typically yield a diet that is overly monotonous and unrealistic. Essentially, you would recommend that people eat vast amounts of white rice. But what's nice about the chord is that it produces a diet where you can actually imagine someone eating this set of foods. Next. If one looks at the cost of the recommended diet over the course of our data set, we find that the cost has actually increased about 3-folds or more over time. So along the x-axis, you have the years. Along the y-axis, you have the cost in 2011 rupees. And you see that the cost of this diet has gone up from 13.9 rupees in 2001 to about 50.7 rupees in 2011. Each bar is then separated into the various different food groups. So one can actually look at their contribution to the overall cost. And dairy, which is the blue bar, is the biggest contributor to overall cost across the entire time period. And in fact, the contribution of dairy to the cost of the recommended diet is approximately the sum of the 3 food groups above it, which are fruit, vegetables, and dark green leafy vegetables. Next slide, please. So if one were to talk about affordability, which is a comparison of the cost of this diet to wages, and one has to look at what's happening to real wages. So here on the left-hand side, we have real wages again in 2011 rupees for both men and women. Again, that conspicuous gap, unfortunately, in the middle of our data set. But 2 things kind of emerge from this graph. One is that hours adjusted real wages have increased for both men and for women, with a particularly steep increase starting from about 2007, but that the increase has been more for men than it has been for women. So the graph is steeper towards the end part of our time series. And so that obviously implies a second finding, which is a gap between these hours adjusted wages between men and women has been diverging. So what does this mean for affordability? So the panel on the right-hand side then converts the chord numbers that we saw on the previous slide with the real wages to come up with our measure of affordability, which is simply chord as a percentage of these hours adjusted wages. So the red line on the top plots this for women and the lower black line for men. And immediately what you can see is that diets are really unaffordable. So this cost of a recommended diet accounts for about 50 to 60% of men's daily wages for an unskilled laborer, and a whopping 80 to 90% of women's daily wages. The other thing to note is that the graph shows some amount of cyclicality within a year. And so the next thing we do is we investigate seasonality. Next slide. So we look at the seasonality in food prices over time relative to January. So we've normalized the prices of all food groups to be 0 in January. And as you can see, the 3 food groups that I've picked out, the fruits, vegetables, and leafy vegetables, so those that are perishable and that do rely strongly on refrigeration and adequate transportation, those are the ones that also, unsurprisingly, show the greatest amount of seasonality. And if one is to look at the period, you'll see that food prices, prices of these 3 commodities, these 3 food groups, are sort of high in the middle of the year, somewhere between May to about October, November. When one looks at the seasonality in wages, you actually find almost nothing across the year, either for wages of men or for women. And so if you put those two things together, what you get is that affordability follows more or less the same patterns as the seasonality in food prices. So the panel on the right plots the seasonality in our affordability measure, which again is the cost of that recommended diet relative to wages. In this case, we plotted it for men. It looks almost identical for women. And again, you see that affordability seems to be the lowest. In other words, this ratio is the highest between the months of about May to October. That's in the middle of the year. Next slide, please. So finally, I'll come to the point that Sridhar picked up on in his introduction. And this is the one that has gained the most amount of traction, which is how affordable are these diets in terms of what proportion of the population can actually afford to buy them. So what we have along the top of this table is we have the cost of a recommended diet for women in the last time period in our data set, which is June 2011. So this is what we estimate from the prices that we have, and that comes to about 45 rupees. If we convert that into PPP dollars, we get a cord for women, which is a little over $3 per person per day. So that cord, if one were to think of it as a cord alternate poverty line, compared to the World Bank poverty line, which is $1.9, that's considerably higher. And so we can use this poverty line to then do some kinds of analyses under certain assumptions to say something about what proportion of the population can actually afford to eat these diets. Next slide. So the first benchmark that we produce is what we call the lower benchmark. And under this benchmark, we assume that everybody spends 100% of their income on food. So you don't have any non-food expenditures whatsoever. And if we assume that everyone does this, then the proportion of the rural population that would be unable to hit this cord poverty line of $3.01 per person per day is about 63.3%. So even if you spend all of your income on food, close to 2/3 of the rural population would not be able to meet this poverty line. And then the poverty gap between those who are unable to reach this, those we call cord poor, and the actual core poverty line would be about 20%. So this is of course unrealistic because people don't just spend on food. And so the second assumption that we made in order to get a second benchmark, what we call the upper benchmark, is that we assume that there are certain requirements for non-food expenditure. And without hard data on what these might be, we estimate 30% of the World Bank poverty line. So the World Bank poverty line is $1.9. We assume that the requirements for non-food expenditure are about 60 cents per person. So when you add that into the estimate of how much it costs to purchase this diet, you end up with a cord plus non-food expenditure poverty line of $3.64. And the proportion of the rural population that would be unable to afford this poverty line is more than 3/4 of the population. So it's 76.2% would not be able to reach this if this were the alternate poverty line. And of course, the gap between their average expenditure of those who are poor and this cord plus non-food poverty line also rises to 28.7. And just to put this in some perspective, if one were to use the World Bank level of $1.9 per person per day, we would arrive at an estimate of about 24% of the rural population that was poor. And the gap, this poverty gap, would be about 5%. So we see that when we account really for the cost of this nutritious diet, we're producing a poverty headcount estimate that's between 2.5 to 3 times what we would get if we use the World Bank. Next slide. So we go into a lot of detail in the paper, but I'll just briefly talk about caveats. So of course, the first one is that the data we're using is almost a decade old. There have been some comments about why this is even relevant, and that I totally agree with that, but having data is not really in the researcher's hand. But even within the set of data that we have in the time period that we're tackling, there are certain things that we really can't account for. So on the left-hand side, I have those that are likely to worsen the outlook. So the first is that the core, of course, does not account for non-food expenditures. We know that non-food expenditures increase with household size and that poorer households typically have larger household sizes. The second is that the core does not take into account anything to do with tastes and preferences. So you might not want to eat the cheapest diet that's available to you, but as soon as you account for actually preferring, say, moong dal over chana dal, you are going to incur a premium over the cost, the minimum cost. And then finally, non-linearities in prices, for example, bulk discounts, which are typically can be attained by richer households. On the other hand, there are also some things that are likely to improve the outlook that we couldn't account for. Most notably that that rural households could be consuming from own production, either from production on the homestead garden or from the actual farm production, and that they could be using the commons. Estimates from the NSSO suggest that both of these are likely to be quite small, and that the vast majority of the rural population does depend heavily on the market. And then lastly, government social protection schemes, for example, the PDS, again, midday meal schemes, ICDS, etc. We can't account for those. Next slide. So just to kind of end, and this will pick up a lot from what...
2 minutes more.
Yeah, this is my last slide. So just to wrap up, and building on what Professor Sen talked about in his presentation, why might we think that the situation could have deteriorated post-COVID? So there is some evidence, as he pointed out, that there were some early impacts on food supply chains. So there's research using prices in urban centers, both from big online retailers as well as other sources, which show that at least initially there was a rise in prices, and it varied across the different food commodities. So you saw, for example, like a 3.5% rise in pulses, according to Sridhar's paper, with slightly higher rises in more perishable commodities. And there's also evidence that initially product availability, particularly of these perishable fruits and vegetables, declined, with a greater impact for longer supply chains. And that speaks also to Professor Sen's point about transportation and the costs of those storage and transportation pieces rising. Another piece of work also shows that there were fairly significant supply side disruptions early on, but that these would have eased within about the first couple of months of the pandemic. And that seems to be also the case with prices. And so we would have seen these early impacts maybe continuing up until about May or a little bit longer, but those would have normalized, quote unquote, fairly quickly. More importantly, however, the affordability piece, of course, has two components, the food price component and the household income component. And so what might be causing a more long-term impact of these, the long-term impact of the pandemic would be coming more from, say, rising unemployment rates and falling household incomes. So the CMIE data showed a huge spike in unemployment right after lockdown, which peaked at about 24% in May. That has also come down and is now hovering, I believe, around 8 or 9%. But there is some suggestive evidence that this job loss experience was worse for women than it was for men, and is fairly persistent. And of course, it's coming on a rising unemployment rate more broadly, which is even outside of the pandemic experience. Last slide. So just to summarize, even in non-COVID times, our data set ended in 2011. This is way pre-pandemic. But even then, diets that meet official nutritional requirements are unaffordable by large swathes of the population. So anywhere between 2/3 to 3/4 of the population cannot afford to buy a diet that is being recommended by ICMR and by the National Institute of Nutrition. And then there is some suggestive evidence to say that this is likely to have worsened under COVID, especially in the first few months of the pandemic. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalyani. Before I call upon Madhura, just another reminder again that please direct your questions in the chat boxes available in all three options, so Zoom, YouTube, or Facebook. and mention the panelists to whom you are addressing the question. Madhura.
Thank you. And there have been two very interesting and sort of different presentations so far. I have a PPT, but I'll come to that later because I think that we have some common grounds now, so we can start. The first point that I'd like to make, my presentation is about ensuring economic and physical access to food. And I want to start with the economic access because that's what we've been discussing in the very interesting calculations that have just been presented to us by Kalyani. So I want to start with the argument that I think there are some things that we thought about or argued about pre-pandemic, but I think the pandemic has made these very visible now. And the first is really the poverty of the international poverty line. So I think it is high time we thought about defining poor, especially in the context of food and nutrition insecurity. If we say that food is one of the basic needs of the population and that you should at least have a healthy, nutritious diet, then it's very clear that we have to junk the World Bank poverty line. And in India, it seems that this government has already junked the poverty level 12 or so. We don't have any estimates of poverty in India. We don't have any survey, even if one wanted to calculate that. So I think this is the first point I want to make. And I'm just going to go to my PPT. How do I share my PPT?
You'll find a green share screen button at the bottom.
Okay, so I'm going to turn off my video for a bit. So I'm starting from the middle of my PPT because I think we discussed the earlier points in other papers. That earlier this year, the FAO report came out with affordability and the ability to buy a healthy diet, and that methodology is actually referred to in Kalyani's paper. And now we have a much more detailed estimate for India. And I want to bring back an old indicator on which many of my friends know I've been writing for a long time, which is the food share. That is the share that the household budget that is spent on food. Because for a long time, looking at economic literature, it is known that as household expenditure increases, share of food expenditure falls. And in the US, which has the largest food assistance program in the world, which has been further expanded during the pandemic, the criterion for identifying a household for food assistance is that they spend more than 1/3 of their monthly budget on food. So taking the 2011-12 consumer expenditure survey from India, and looking particularly, 95% of rural households spent more than 1/3 of their budget on food, and 90% of urban households. Now, clearly we are not the US, and one could say this criterion is too strict. And the criterion that I have used in the past and today is a food share of 50%. And even with, if you spend 50% on food, we would see that more than 80% of rural households, it's much less in urban, 40% of urban households were food insecure, in the sense that they're spending more than 50% of their budget on food. Now, I want to say a couple of things here. One is, of course, that many of us think that during the last 10 years, and some of the data that was leaked from 2017-18 suggests that things had worsened, consumer expenditure had worsened. And then, of course, we all know that there's been a collapse of employment and livelihoods for the vast majority of workers, because 90% of our workers are in the urban informal sector, where contracts are precarious, no social security benefits, and workers didn't even get money to go back home. They had to walk back home, as we all saw. So I think that household incomes and have fallen sharply, even though we don't have any numbers on that. Our village surveys suggest that indebtedness has gone up in a big way in the last few months. So household expenditures may not have fallen as much, but nevertheless, household expenditures are likely to have fallen. And given the already high share of the household budget that was spent on food, it implies that there have been cuts, big cuts in food expenditure. I want to make a point here, which is, I hadn't noted really earlier, but the calculation we just saw from Kalyani suggested that 80%, even to get this recommended diet, the poverty line they calculated assumed that only 20% of the $3 a day was spent on, non-food. So we're still in a very, very restrictive non-food space, if you like, and the numbers that we saw were high, even assuming that people spend more than 60 to 70% of their monthly expenditure on food items. It's also interesting that during the pandemic, the US food stamp program is now reaching 1 in 3 families with children. I just heard the statistic yesterday. And so that's the kind of food poverty, food insecurity in the United States. It's clearly much, much higher than the numbers that we saw from Kalyani a few minutes ago. So the first point I really want to make is that we have to start talking more about the economic access to adequate, nutritious food, and something that has been neglected because we were stuck to an old poverty line. The second point I want to make is that the physical access was something that we didn't concern ourselves with much. And in fact, the whole argument for cash transfers was that food is easily available and people could choose what they wanted. We didn't need the public distribution system. As I will show, luckily we had it in place during the pandemic, so it could be used, at least in some states, to expand the availability of food. We've already heard about food prices from Abhijit Sen. I just want to bring to the notice of some of you another analysis, which I'm not going to go into today, by R. Ramkumar in the Review of Agrarian Studies, which has also looked at market arrivals and food price volatility in quite detail. I'm going to skip those graphs and go to the second point of my presentation today, which is that I think what the pandemic has shown as far as food insecurity is concerned is very clear. We have to move away from the policy perspective of conditional cash transfers and move. I'm talking about India, perhaps other parts of South Asia and some parts of Africa at least. We have to have universal or near universal coverage of our welfare programs, and they have to be a combination of cash and kind and income transfers, and they have to be unconditional. In fact, if anything, my argument is completely strengthened by the previous speaker. If 73% of households are poor in terms of food insecurity, there's no question of having a targeted program. Targeted programs are when 5% or 10% or 15 or 20% of a particular population has to be reached. when 60 or 70 or more percent of a population is to be reached, it doesn't make sense anywhere in the world to have a targeted program. And it's unfortunate that even after the pandemic, some documents such as the high-level panel of experts of the FAO are talking about targeted social protection programs. So let me now turn to my final point. I'm not looking at the time, but I'll take less than my time. It's a Kerala experience. And as it happens, I'm sitting in Kerala today. At the start of the pandemic, the chief minister said that no one would go hungry during the pandemic. And I think, from at least what I've read in the media, this promise has been ensured. And it's worth spending a few minutes on how the government of Kerala ensured that no one went hungry. And I'm talking about from March, from the lockdown to date. It was a combination of direct food transfers, transfers in cash, and income support. Let me start with the food transfers. The public distribution system, the quantity distributed, and the price was changed. Free rice was distributed to 35 kg for poor households and 15 kg for other households. And the coverage was 98% of the population, and about 1 million tons have already been distributed just in Kerala. One of the criticisms of the PDS has been that it's been very serial focused. And I think the next graphic shows how Kerala used this period to actually expand the basket of food and provide a nutritious food package. So there's a 16-item grocery kit that was distributed with several pulses or lentils, oils, etc., spices. And this again had a coverage of about 95% of the population, starting with some of the poorest households identified geographically. For example, the pockets of tribal with tribal concentration, which we know are some of the most disadvantaged sections of the population. From September onwards, this grocery kit has been brought down to an 8-item grocery kit and is still being distributed. Now, schools in India have been physically closed and remain closed for almost 7 months now, and large number of children depend on school meals. Now, in Kerala, food kits, which comprised rice plus 9 grocery items, have been distributed regularly to children from pre-primary to standard 8. And I happened to get the number yesterday. 2.6 million children are being reached through these monthly kits. Many of you must have heard of Marcus Rashford's campaign in UK, a very important campaign to get school meals to children during the break, the summer break, and now the midterm break. And they're talking about 1.5 million children. Kerala has already been sending food kits out to 2.6 million, children. I won't go into all the other things, the supplementary food, which is normally given through the Anganwadi centers, which again are closed all over India. These have been delivered to about 1 million children. For the first few months, particularly March to May, community kitchens of various kinds were run to give cooked food to migrant and stranded workers. Next was a set of cash transfers. During the lockdown, obviously, there was no question of economic activity. So various kinds of cash transfers were made, primarily through pensions, through labor welfare boards, and also some to those groups which are left out of these pensions. Many of you may know that Kerala has one of the largest pension systems in the sense of coverage. Agricultural workers have pensions, coir workers have pensions, and so on. BD workers have pensions. So a large part of the informal sector is reached, and these pension payments were in many really advanced early on in April, May. As the economy opens, of course, we have to get back to other kinds of income support. And the two big ones here are the wage employment programs. Again, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which all of you know about, it's a national program, has been expanded from 80 million to 140 million days. But what some of you may not know is that Kerala is the only state in India which already had, this is pre-COVID, had an urban employment guarantee program also in place. The Ayangali Urban Employment Guarantee Scheme proposes to give 4 million person days of employment in this year, 2020-21. There are various other livelihood support measures, and I'm not really going to go into all of them, but a large part of it is through subsidies, through interest-free loans for self-employment, Kudambashri women's groups, but many other activities, special subsidies for about 2 million who have returned from the Gulf region. So let me come to my concluding slide, which is that if you're, the whole world is talking now about food and nutrition security and zero hunger being the second SDG, my first point is that we have to start looking at employment and income security. And that means we have to look at measures such as the affordability measure, which was talked about, and the food share measure. We have to move beyond the narrow poverty line, whether it is the $1.9 a day or whether it is the Indian poverty line. Second is that in this context of the pandemic, and at least I think for the medium term, I'm talking about the next few years, 2 to 3 years perhaps, we have to have a universal safety net combining nutritionally rich, I would like to emphasize that, nutritionally rich kind transfers along with various kinds of cash and income support. And this, of course, we haven't discussed it today, but requires a whole new fiscal stance. But I think if there is political commitment to this, it can be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madhura. We've had a round of very good, very interesting presentations on 3 different dimensions of this crisis and what is likely to happen. So I'm using my prerogative as the chair to first initiate this discussion. But meanwhile, I urge participants to post their questions on Facebook, whichever channel you're watching, Facebook, Zoom, or YouTube. Most countries around the world have implemented some kind of a lockdown as an initial response to the pandemic. But the widespread consensus is that the Indian lockdown was perhaps the most draconian in the world. This perhaps reflected an Indian approach to the pandemic as a law and order issue rather than as a public health emergency. The heavy-handed approach was reflected in the police crackdown on even the slightest infringement of lockdown regulations, and by assigning the prime role to the Home Ministry rather than the Health Ministry. This was also compounded by the utter confusion caused by the flurry of clarifications, amendments, and numerous changes to the list of what was allowed and what was not. The most glaring one was the failure to communicate clearly and categorically early on that agricultural activity, especially in the ongoing Rabi harvest, was not part of the lockdown. Much confusion and police brutality was displayed in the initial weeks as farmers proceeded to harvest their crops and tried to sell their produce. Although the general consensus is that agricultural production pertaining to the Rabi crop, including harvesting activity, was not particularly severely affected, the marketing of agricultural produce was badly impacted. This also resulted in the lockdown having a differentiated impact on peasant livelihoods. Most accounts from Punjab, for instance, from that time indicated that large farmers encountered fewer hurdles in getting their produce to the market compared to smaller growers. Naturally, this has left peasants operating smaller holdings far more vulnerable as the pandemic advanced. Initial field surveys by the FAS and others during the lockdown, mostly through telephonic interviews, indicated that there may have been a scale factor at play in crop harvesting. That is, smaller peasants who were more dependent on labor, family as well as hired labor, incurred higher costs relative to larger farmers who could deploy mechanization in harvesting operations. This obviously had consequences for peasant incomes, which affected their ability to cope with the situation as the pandemic advanced. This differentiated impact was not just in terms of their impact on peasant classes, but also had a geographical dimension. Thus, for example, although the Rabi harvest and procurement operations, especially of the two major cereals, paddy and wheat, may have been relatively unaffected in Punjab, Haryana, and parts of Andhra Pradesh, this was not the case in most other parts of the country. Growers of some crops also appear to have fared better, at least initially. For instance, the FAS team found that potato growers in West Bengal and sugarcane cultivators in Bihar managed to have higher levels of disposable incomes compared to those growing other crops in the immediate days following the lockdown. So in this sense too, there appears to have been a differentiated impact on incomes and livelihoods. The trajectory of the official Indian response to COVID-19 reveals a basic asymmetry. The lockdown was a sudden shutdown of the economy, like a switch that was turned off suddenly and without warning. But the unlocking has been a process that has been uneven and erratic in fits and starts, if you will. Naturally, the unevenness is not just in terms of its spatial or geographical consequences, but also in terms of its differentiated impact on social classes in rural India. Unlocking is therefore to be regarded as a process, not an event. Obviously, this implies that the revival of wages and incomes is not guaranteed simply because a lockdown is no longer in place. The unevenness and the uncertainty associated with the process of unlocking also has consequences for rural incomes in the days ahead. The underlying health dimension of this crisis, especially the uncertainties posed by the spread of the virus, amplify the risks for those whose incomes have already taken a hit. The prospects for the peasantry from the Kharif harvest that is to happen soon are thus not better simply because the lockdown has been lifted. The small peasant and rural laboring households' ability to cope with the sustained pressure of falling incomes is thus considerably weakened, which also amplifies the food security dimension of this crisis. Market arrivals of agricultural produce during the Rabi season have been significantly lower in the current year, even though by all accounts, the output was not lower compared to last year. And although procurement by official agencies may have been reasonably good, they have remained confined to the two main cereals and in the major states of Punjab, Haryana, and to some extent Andhra Pradesh. The absence of state procurement for other crops and in most other parts of the country, even as marketing channels had suffered severe disruption, obviously led to a fall in prices realized by farmers. Obviously, this has depressed incomes of peasants and has severely curtailed their ability to purchase food items. An added dimension to this crisis has been the complete collapse of India's milk economy, as well as meat and poultry and fisheries, which usually provides a measure of income support to rural households. The collapse of rural livelihoods since the onset of the pandemic has been worsened by the reverse migration into the poor states in the Indian heartland from where they originated. Preliminary surveys by FAS teams, for instance, appear to indicate that this has depressed farm and non-farm wages in rural India. The erratic and uneven recovery of economic activity has also meant that rural unemployment remains a major worry. Although the public distribution system appears to have acted as some kind of a lifeline in most states, these surveys also clearly indicate a lowering of consumption of even the most basic food items and of course increasing levels of indebtedness. The shutdown of the functioning Anganwadis in many parts of India or the assured delivery of food kits in place of that, in parts to rural households, and of midday meal schemes in schools has worsened the crisis for rural households. That the union government sat on a mountain of food grain stocks at such a time is indeed ironical. The one obviously redeeming case appears to be Kerala, almost as if it is another country. The state government not only rapidly expanded the scope of the PDS in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, but also ensured delivery of a minimum basket of essential commodities to all citizens. It also established a system of decentralized procurement of agricultural produce from farmers, which, however rudimentary, has protected earnings at least to some extent. Professor Sen, what is the likely impact? You talked about the divergence between the wholesale price index and the consumer price index that is happening. And in the context of the recent changes to the legislation governing the marketing of agricultural produce, what do you think specifically their impact would be on this particular aspect of the problem?
Me to come in now? Do you want me to come in now? Do you want me to speak now?
Yes.
Well, I really don't know. My best guess is very little. I think really the problem with what has been announced is that similar things have been announced in the past with very little effect on how markets work in India. And the fond belief in all of this is that the private sector would jump in, invest a lot in infrastructure, reduce costs of movement, increase investment in storage, especially cold storage, reduce thereby losses of wastage, none of which has really happened. They may well happen over a period of years, but we've been on this particular course for about 20 years already, with very little to show on the ground. Instead of which, what you now have is a great uncertainty for some farmers about whether what system they've gotten used to will continue. And that is, I think, likely to be the immediate impact rather than the longer run promise of private sector investment in logistics and storage. So my guess is not much will happen immediately.
Sridhar, can you unmute?
Yeah, we have another question for Abhijit from Ram Kumar. Exports have not risen for all crops. Exports have risen for rice, wheat, and sugar, but fallen sharply for marine products, meat, spices, tea, and poultry products. Would you like to comment on this? And he also asks that market arrivals have been low due to the fact, as you mentioned, there is greater storage of produce outside the mandis. But this would only be true for non-perishables. What about the perishables like fruits and vegetables?
Right. For non-perishables, what I said is valid. For perishables, it isn't.
Yeah.
Now, on perishables, unfortunately, data is even weaker because the production side data is virtually non-available. So I would say I really don't know. We do know that for potato and onions, prices have been going up. some of that is due to localized problems on the production side. Much of it, I guess, would be due to the fact that perishables being perishables, if they can't be transported in time, simply perish.
Yeah.
And that's it. On the export side, I did mention that as far as meat, and that's buffalo meat in general, I mean, in particular, and on marine products, exports are lower this year than they have been in the past. But they have actually recovered considerably, and the amount that we are seeing is not an aberration. That is the latest month's export figures compared to, say, the last 5 years, if you compare them. So I stand by what I said on exports. Anything else?
Yeah. Do we have anything else? No.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Can I?
Yeah.
This is to Kalyani, and it's been bugging me a little bit. Kalyani, you need to compare the cost of your basket, which is in nominal rupees. Shouldn't you do that with nominal rather than real incomes or wages?
They're all real incomes. I mean, they're all real. The prices are real and the wages are real, both.
By real prices, what do you mean?
But adjusted for inflation. So adjusted for inflation and presented in 2011 rupees for comparison.
So each item is divided by the overall inflation index, is it?
Yeah, we do it for the overall cost of the recommended diet as a whole, and then for wages as a whole.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kalyani, I just had one comment. Not that it takes away anything from what you just said, but it probably makes it even more stark. The fact that your series ends in 2011, and which was the time when rural wages were increasing, were accelerating to some extent, largely
Yes.
because of the MNREGA and possibly because of that. But since 2015, there was a dip, although they also recovered subsequently. But would you like to comment on that and what?
Yeah, so I mean, the point of our series ending in 2011 is really because our information on prices ends then. Both if we were to use the household consumption expenditure survey from NSSO, which the last round is 2011-2012, or if we were to use this series, which is slightly richer in terms of its panel aspect. So we were kind of, our hands were tied from that perspective. But I think you're right that if one were to hypothesize about what would have happened post 2011, my sense is that it would have been, the situation would have been worse. So if one looks at, say, the Mandi data, Mandi price data, which is, in essence, it's sort of closer to a producer price or a farm gate price, you do see that those prices have been consistently increasing. We have that information up until 2018. And as you say, that rural incomes have been declining, including NREGA incomes, which have kind of stopped being indexed to inflation and have more or less stagnated. So overall, without any real hard data basis to be able to make this claim, my guess would be that all of this has gotten worse since 2011.
Madhura, you have some comments or observations to make?
Yeah, I think that one point I'd like to say that what Abhijit said is very important now more than ever is data collection. We need some real-time data or some kind of data on household expenditures or incomes. I mean, we don't have on incomes, but maybe we could start. The other point is that I think, Kalyani, again, this is a comment that if you had taken the agricultural year instead of the calendar year when you looked at seasonality, it's very clear that the prices are highest in the lean and monsoon seasons. So your April, May to September is when, which is also, I mean, traditionally the hungry season because in April, May is the lowest employment in rural India's for agriculture. And I was surprised that seasonality in wage rates did not come out. But again, I'm not sure if we had done it July to June, whether it would have shown a different pattern.
Yeah, so absolutely, totally agree with your point that it lines up with the lean season, which just makes it worse because a lot of these households don't have a way to smooth income over the course of the year and hence to smooth consumption. In terms of wages, all I'll say is that these were wages of unskilled laborers. There are 17 other occupations in that data set, including various different harvesting, threshing, picking, other sub-activities within agriculture. And it's quite possible that if one were to look at seasonalities within those, one would see something that tracks the agricultural seasons, as you mentioned. We haven't done that yet. Yeah.
Can I just add, Sridhar, just that for all those listeners that at FAS, Arindam Das has been monitoring rural wage rates quite closely. And so I think that there's a real dip after 2014 and small reversal after that, but rural wage growth is something also that we have to very carefully watch now.
I'll just add a little bit to what Madhura said. The data actually changed base in 13-14. So it was the wage data, the entire panel changed. But that data is available to the present. You can get it up to September, I mean, up to August. So you do have a series which goes from, I think it's November 2013 or something like that, or October 2013, coming up right up to the present. And it's comparable except that there's a break somewhere in 2013. It suddenly drops.
Yes.
Now on the price data, I'm a bit surprised. It's quite possible that the government is not releasing it, but that data is precisely the data which is used to construct the CPI-AL. And the CPI-AL and the CPI-IW are still being constructed. So that data is there. And it's probably simply that they're not releasing it in a form that, in which case, it's just symptomatic of this government. It doesn't like to share data.
That is exactly what it is. Of course, the data is being collected, but even within the government, I've heard from people working on, say, the economic survey that the data is held very close to the chest. It's not shared even openly, even amongst them. We did reach out to them and ask for it and were told that it's highly sensitive and is not shared widely. So it's not that the data doesn't exist, it's that it's not given to us. And so one of the points that our paper was trying to make is that calculating the chord is extremely simple. It can be done in Excel. It can be done by people who aren't particularly mathematically sophisticated because it is meant to be used as a monitoring metric. And so within the government, with the people who do actually have access to this data, we're trying to advocate for them to actually just calculate this on a policy basis for them to use in their programming. So, and that was the kind of purpose that there are much more sophisticated methods of these costing exercises that require a lot more, that are a lot more intricate, but the core is incredibly simple and can be done by almost everybody. So we're trying to push, even if we can't do it, for someone within the government to do it for us.
Kalyani, can I just ask a small question there? Now that you have actually worked out the diets in different districts and different states of India, so you know where people are having rice, moong dal, green vegetable, etc.
Yeah.
You have the exact quantities, you have the diet. So could we not just use market prices today and do some back of the envelope calculations?
So just a clarification, what we're using is not actual consumption data. All we're doing is we're taking, suppose the NIN says you have to have 9 servings of cereals, each serving has to be 30 grams. So there's a total number of grams of cereals you should be eating per day. Within that state, district, month combination, we calculate what is the cheapest way of attaining that, whatever it is, number of grams of cereals per day. And then add up the cost of that across all the different food groups to say, if you were sourcing your entire diet from the market, what is the minimum cost at which you could do so, given that you live in this state and this district at this, in this month of this year. So it's at that level. And so if one were to then incorporate, say, preferences, and people have actually done this, colleagues of mine have done this in Myanmar, where they've used sort of the Myanmar equivalent of the NSS to look at weighting these cost metrics by what people are actually consuming. Then you actually find that costs go up by, there's a premium of about 20%, but that's not what we're doing because we're not using household level data. So what we do have right now is we have a national level set of the most common items across different food groups, and then we can look at that at a state level and at a district level and get that kind of granularity. But we're still not saying anything about what individual households are consuming.
There's one, I think this is the last comment we will take, and there's one on YouTube for Kalyani. There are issues in measuring household expenditures. For example, NSSO recently included expenditure on education for children staying away. The reporting of amounts may be erroneous. Any help for farmers poor must include cost of health education in addition to food. Your comments.
Yeah, absolutely. So just again, to say that what we're costing is not what people are actually consuming or actually spending. We're just saying if you were to access the market and buy all of your food from the market, what is the minimum amount you would have to spend to meet these guidelines? And as I said, we're not accounting for rent, we're not accounting for health, for expenditure on education. We're not even accounting for the fact that there are multiple people in the household, right? So all we're doing is comparing that cost of a recommended diet against the daily wage of an adult male or female person, not taking into account that a household is not just one adult male earning and eating for themselves. And so if you add in all of that other stuff, which is what we tried to do in the second benchmark, to put a very, very low, very conservative estimate of what one could be spending on non-food expenditure. And we find that under those really ridiculous estimates of what one would be spending, you find that 3/4 of the population can't afford it. And so any more realistic estimates based on what people are actually spending, including things like unforeseen health expenditures, which are often large as a proportion of household income, would only make the case even worse. So that's something we haven't done, but I can sort of hypothesize to the direction in which it would go. Thanks.
I think we have had.
Sridhar, can I ask something to Abhijit? See your comment that there's a class of rural households now that is storing grain, which will eventually, but this class is spending on fertilizers and actual expenditure on production, but why is this class not spending, or could this class potentially spend on the kind of infrastructure we're talking about, like storage, better storage or better processing, value added? What would be your comment on that?
Well, up to a point, yes. And clearly they have spent something on storage, otherwise they wouldn't be able to store. But they clearly can't do, well, some of them might be to set up cold chains, for example. They're simply not big enough in most cases. But more importantly, I think it is that this is something which happens every now and then. Let us not forget that before this came demonetization, which actually hit rural marketing very badly. So a lot of the rural marketing networks actually broke down. So all of these other stuff have come out as part replacements. But networks take time to complete. And I'm afraid the main problem with the current reforms is that this will be a further shock to whatever network development we had started. So that this vacuum will be, and the objective of these reforms is that the vacuum is filled up by corporate players. But a clash between the corporate players and an old-fashioned network is going to be played out all over again at a time when the old-fashioned networks actually had collapsed as a result of demonetization. So I'm afraid that, we are going to go through this lack of trust in marketing operations for a considerably longer period. And trust is what drives markets.
Can you unmute?
There's one final question, actually two. Given that the central government, and it's not addressed to any speaker in particular, given that the central government does not seem to have the political appetite to ensure food security, how much can states actually do within the manacles of a budgetary constraints like the FRBM? And the second one is availability of resources is one important dimension without a doubt. However, cultural norms with respect to sharing these resources across gender threats is equally important, if not more. Is food security gendered in India?
I'll be very quick. We are well over time. Yes, of course, the states are in a very bad financial situation now. And I think all of you know that the size of package announced, post-pandemic package announced by the government of India is one of the lowest in the world. So whether it's countries of Latin America, or whether it's countries, developing countries, or the European countries, the pandemic, or the US, there's just not enough money that has been given by the central government to post-pandemic recovery, and specifically to essential expenditures within that, such as food and nutrition security. And this is going to hit the states very soon, state governments very soon. Second is, yes, of course, food insecurity is gendered, and I'm not sure if the first slide of Kalyani's, I had some slide on malnutrition and so on, but I thought we are familiar with those numbers, so didn't go into them. But it is much worse on average for women in terms of the pre-pandemic and also post-pandemic. I think this was mentioned in terms of access to income, job losses, increased work burden at home, which means that their energy expenditure would have gone up, and at the same time reduced food consumption because they're usually the last to eat. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've had a very interesting and lively session. Sandeepan, would you like to make your closing comments? And I mean,
yeah. Okay. So, thank you, Sridhar, and we are at the close of the session now. Let me thank Professor Abhijit Sen, Professor Madhura Swaminathan, and Dr. Kalyani Raghunathan for this lively panel discussion. Let me also thank Sridhar for chairing the session. On this note, I would say we would close this session, and with a commitment that very soon under the Pandemic Studies Unit work, a series of this series of webinars will continue even in the next 2 months.